Hello, welcome to the video. My name is S, and I love photo mode. I think that the growing popularity of photo modes within video games is one of the best trends of the gaming industry within the last 10 years. Whilst yes, being able to take a pretty picture of a game for you to post online is essentially just free advertising and doesn't really add any depth to the gameplay or the narrative, as someone who really loves filmmaking and image composition, photo mode really just scratches my itch to be creative. Now, I'm not going to ramble on much longer about my own experiences because I realise you clicked onto this video for a reason. You want to learn the ins and outs of gaming photo mode so you can take your own in-game photography from something like this to something a little more like this. The information in this video can apply to a lot of photo modes, but will primarily apply to the photo mode for Cyberpunk 2077. Learning how to use photo mode is basically like learning the principles of real-world photography, as a lot of the in-game photo modes use tools adjacent to using a real-world camera. This makes sense, but also means that it's not always highly intuitive, so I'm going to break down the various tools with simple explanations. Please note that this video will not be covering things like using character pose menus, and is more about image composition, camera settings, and lighting. With all of that covered, let's get into it. Now, before we go into the various photo mode settings, let's talk a little bit about image composition. Image composition refers to techniques that are used to lay out the elements in an image. Our human eyes really enjoy seeing images in certain ways, and if we understand how this works, we can instantly upgrade any photo that you take. I'm bringing this up first as learning how to lay out an image is as important, if not more so, than knowing how to use the photo mode tools itself. So, for starters, let's just open photo mode without changing any of the settings. The most basic composition trick is something called the rule of thirds. You may have noticed that in photo mode itself, it provides you with a little grid, and by lining up elements of your image within this grid, particularly within 1/3 of the image frame, it can help you create scenes that are more visually interesting than just sticking your subject in the middle and calling it a day. For example, in this scene here, the elements around V are kind of just there and they're not really adding anything to the image. But if I slide slightly across and line them up with the grid, suddenly they seem a lot more strategically placed, so the overall image looks a lot more interesting. Other popular composition techniques include using leading lines, using symmetry, and using framing. Before you go and start taking any photos, I'd recommend finding a cheat sheet of common methods of image composition. I also found a really good blog post on a website called katebackdrop.com, and I think that explains a bunch of techniques really well, and I'll put a link to that in the description. If you're more of a visual learner, you could also take a look at your favourite films. Filmmaking also uses image composition to lay out the actors, to lay out the props, to lay out the sets and locations, and these can also serve as really good references on how to lay out a photo. And now, we'll move on to actual photo mode itself. When you open photo mode, you'll meet the first menu, and in here you've got the controls for the camera itself. I'd recommend turning off full collision so the camera doesn't get stuck, but otherwise the only setting we'll be focusing on here is the field of view, as this is actually what will affect the aesthetics of your photo. The field of view slider is essentially equivalent to picking your camera lens. In traditional photography, camera lenses have something called a focal length, and the focal length is what determines the field of view. Obviously, field of view is a term more familiar to gamers, so it makes sense that this is the term they've used. Turning the field of view down will make the photo mode camera appear more zoomed in and will make shapes look flatter and closer together. Lower FOVs are usually closer to how the human eye actually sees, and therefore this is the most flattering way to take photos of faces. It is also very useful for making subjects in your image look closer together than they actually are, or something called forced perspective. For Cyberpunk specifically, I find 35 to 40 to be the sweet spot for taking photos of faces. Choosing a higher FOV will open the frame up, giving you a lot more on screen at once, and making items appear further away. However, at a certain point, it will start to produce distortion, often known as the fisheye effect, as items will appear to bulge towards the middle of the screen. Higher FOVs are great for taking landscape shots or highly stylized close-ups, where you can utilize the camera warp to emphasize certain elements. High FOV is also how people take those funny close-ups where the characters have huge foreheads. The more you know. Moving on now, we'll head into the Depth of Field tab. The Depth of Field tab is where you're controlling what's in focus in your image and how much you want in focus at one time. By default, the game chooses an aperture of 4.0 with the autofocus turned on. We'll address aperture in just a moment, but let's discuss the autofocus first. The autofocus in this game seems to favour keeping V in focus, which is great because most people want to take cool shots of V. However, if you want to take a lovely photo of your tomb, you'll need to turn the autofocus off and use the manual focus distance slider. It can be a bit difficult to tell if the focus is correct, so you might just want to disable depth of field if that makes it easier. Now onto aperture. Choosing your aperture is the part of traditional photography which actually affects the depth of field itself. The depth of field effect is directly altered by the aperture. All you need to know is that a smaller aperture will tighten your depth of field, meaning there is less in focus at once. So if you want all of the focus to be on a very pinpoint specific part of your image, you want to make the aperture lower. As the aperture gets higher, the amount in focus at once gets wider. By utilizing this, you can give your images just a slight background blur that can really lend itself to looking cinematic. So as you can see, aperture isn't really that complicated, but it can lend itself to a very important part of the aesthetics of your image. We're going to jump over to the lighting tab now. Something that I really love about Cyberpunk is that it gives you 3 optional spotlights to use to add additional lighting to your scene. These can be really great if you found a cool background but the foreground is too dark, or you want to highlight certain parts of your scene. The 3 spotlights are controlled independently, and they are a little unwieldy to control, especially if you're on a controller, but if you can get the hang of moving them around, they are such a great tool. So let's talk through what each slider does for one of these lights. First you have brightness, and this changes the perceived intensity of the light. And then you have range. This affects how far the light reaches. This can be useful if you want to, for example, light a character's face, but you don't want that light to also reach the background. Then you have hue, which is the colour of the light, and then you have saturation, which affects how strong that colour is. Then there's luminance. Now, after some experimenting, I can't really tell the difference between luminance and brightness. By technical definition, luminance typically refers to the amount of light being emitted, as opposed to the perceived brightness of the light itself, but from what I can tell, in most scenarios, changing luminance or brightness kind of does the same thing. Following that, you then have inner and outer angle. This changes the size and shape of the cone of light. By changing these sliders, you can make the light bigger and also control how soft or harsh the outline is. Now, you don't need to use the spotlights if you don't want to, but they really can add to your image. For example, if we take this scene in Jig Jig Street, the background looks great, but V is getting a little bit lost. I'm going to utilize a basic lighting technique that is called 3-point lighting to really elevate the way V looks in this scene. 3-point lighting is a great general use lighting setup that involves giving subject 3 lights. You have a key light for the front, a fill light for the shadows on the side of the face, and then you have a backlight around the back to help separate them from the background. Understanding how each of these lights help means you can mix and match their use in future for creative effect. Along with composition, lighting is perhaps one of the most important ways to elevate your image. If you're not comfortable using the spotlights, try and find areas in the game with plentiful light sources that you can use to your advantage. And now we'll move on to our last topic of the day, which is the Effects tab. This tab is essentially your built-in image editor, but you're doing the editing before you take the photo. This is how you can tweak certain parts of the image that maybe you can't quite fix with all the other tools at your disposal. You've got a bunch of options here, so let's go through them. The first one is exposure, and this darkens or lightens all parts of the image, including shadows and highlights. The next option is contrast, and what this does is decrease or increase the difference between the darkest and lightest parts of the image. The next section is highlights, and this is so that you can target those brightest parts of your image. You can make them darker or brighter. This is very useful if you have background lighting that is too bright. Next up is vignette, and this adds a vignette around the image, which is a sort of shadow that starts at the corners. Next up is chromatic aberration. Now this is an effect that replicates lens distortion, and by turning the effect up and down, you can see that the effect is added to the edge of the frame. This can look really cool on things like neon lighting. And then finally you have grain, and this will add a grain texture to your image, which looks both very cinematic and also replicates the look of using physical film. Not everyone likes this look, but it can look quite cool when used effectively. Now in many games, including Cyberpunk, you do have a few other things, such as the character posing tools and the frames and the stickers. But the intention of this guide was to mostly focus on the more photography-based settings. So hopefully now you should be a little bit more clued up on what the various tools mean and what they do. If this guide has been useful, I'd really appreciate a like, comment and subscribe, and if this video has helped you take some cool shots in your favourite game, feel free to share a link to them because I would really love to see. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.